There is something profoundly unsettling about watching a king wait. Not the waiting we ordinary mortals endure, the queue at the supermarket, the delayed train, the doctor's appointment that runs 30 minutes late. No, this is waiting on an altogether different scale. This is the world holding its breath while a monarch's body decides whether it will cooperate with the treatments designed to keep him alive. And in late March of 2025, that is precisely what unfolded behind the discreet facade of the London clinic in Marylebone, where King Charles III had been admitted for what Buckingham Palace, with their trademark mastery of understatement, described as scheduled treatment for the cancer that has shadowed his first years on the throne. The scene outside that clinic told you everything the carefully worded statements did not. The crowd that gathered was not large. This is Britain, after all, and we do not do overwrought emotion in public. But it was telling. Elderly women with shopping bags pausing on their way to Waitrose, men in suits checking their watches, and then, almost guiltily, glancing up at those blank windows. A few well-wishers clutching cards and small bouquets, unsure whether to leave them at the door or take them home. And hovering over it all, that peculiarly British atmosphere of anxious politeness, as though everyone understood that the proper response to a constitutional crisis is to queue quietly and wait your turn. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. The atmosphere outside that clinic was thick with something I can only describe as suspended animation. You could feel it in the way people spoke in hushed tones, as though raising one's voice might somehow disturb the delicate proceedings within. You could see it in the faces of the police officers stationed at the entrance, trained to remain expressionless, but unable quite to hide the weight of what their presence signified. This was not a state occasion. This was not a jubilee or a wedding or a funeral procession. This was something far more intimate and far more terrifying, the mortal body of a man who happens to wear a crown, fighting a battle that no amount of royal privilege can win. And because this is Britain in the 21st century, the battle was being fought not in the glare of television cameras, but behind those heavily locked doors, with only the occasional statement from the palace to remind us that inside, a king was struggling. The contrast between the public image and the private reality could not have been starker. Just days earlier, Charles had been photographed leaving the same clinic, waving to the crowd with that characteristic gesture, half royal wave, half awkward acknowledgement of the sheer oddity of being watched while ill. He had smiled, or at least his mouth had curved upward in a way that might have been a smile if you didn't look too closely at his eyes. And the crowd had responded as crowds always do, with that mixture of genuine affection and reflexive deference that the royal family has cultivated for centuries. But the photographs told a different story if you knew where to look. The slight stoop that no amount of tailoring can disguise, the careful, measured steps, the way his hand gripped the doorframe just a moment longer than necessary. These were not the movements of a man in robust health. These were the movements of a 76-year-old monarch whose body, despite his famously relentless work ethic, was beginning to insist on terms. And what a work ethic it has been! The statistics from last year are almost absurd when you consider them properly. 372 official engagements at an age when most men are content with a garden center visit and the occasional round of golf. This is a man who has reportedly fallen asleep at his desk with papers stuck to his face, an image his younger son Harry saw fit to share with the world, presumably without considering how it might make his father feel to have his private struggles broadcast as anecdotal color. But then, consideration for how one's actions might affect others has never been the Sussexes' strong suit, has it? The point is that Charles has been running himself ragged, pushing through the fatigue and the treatment side effects with a determination that speaks to something deeper than mere duty. It speaks to fear. The fear that his reign, so long awaited, so painfully anticipated through decades of his mother's serene and seemingly eternal presence, will be cruelly abbreviated. The fear that he will not have time to leave his mark, to complete the projects that matter to him, to prove that he was more than just the longest-serving heir apparent in British history. And so he works, and works, and works some more, while his doctors presumably advise rest, and his wife Camilla watches with that expression of wifely concern that has become so familiar over the years. The slightly tightened mouth, the hand that reaches out to touch his arm, the murmured words that cameras cannot capture, but body language screams aloud. The interior monologue of a monarch facing his own mortality is not something we are meant to contemplate. The British Constitution, such as it is, prefers its sovereigns to be symbolic rather than human, icons rather than individuals. But Charles has never been good at that distinction. He feels things too deeply, cares too passionately, worries too persistently about the state of the nation and the world, and, one suspects, his own legacy. And so as he sat in that hospital room, with the machinery of modern medicine humming discreetly in the background, and the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down upon his shoulders, what must he have been thinking? The obvious things, certainly. The pain of the treatment, the uncertainty of the outcome, the indignity of it all. But also, I suspect, the political calculus that no monarch can ever truly escape. What happens if I cannot continue? What happens to the transition that no one wants to discuss openly? What happens to William, to Catherine, to those precious grandchildren whose futures I have spent my entire life preparing to safeguard? These are not questions a king can ask aloud, not in any formal sense. But they are questions that answer themselves in the small hours of the night when the medication has worn off and the reality of one's situation becomes impossible to ignore. The long-term consequences of this moment are only beginning to reveal themselves. We speak of succession as though it were a matter of constitutional procedure, a few signatures, a proclamation, a ceremony at St. James's Palace, and the business is concluded. But succession is never that simple, not really. Succession is about the transfer not just of power, but of emotional loyalty, of the public's willingness to invest their hopes and fears and dreams in a new figurehead. And that transfer, if it happens too quickly or too chaotically, can leave scars that take generations to heal. The palace understands this, which is why the statements about Charles's health have been so carefully calibrated, acknowledging enough to satisfy curiosity, withholding enough to maintain dignity, and above all, avoiding any suggestion that the machinery of transition is already in motion. But of course, it is in motion. It has been in motion since the moment Charles's diagnosis was confirmed. The question is not whether William is preparing. The question is how much preparation is happening and who is directing it, and what it means for the delicate balance of relationships that holds the royal family together. There is something almost unbearably poignant about the image of Charles waving from that hospital doorway. The wave itself is a strange gesture, isn't it? Not quite a greeting, not quite a farewell, not quite an acknowledgement. It is a ritual gesture, performed automatically, the product of decades of training and thousands of public appearances. And yet in that moment, with the cameras clicking and the crowd murmuring and the future hanging in the balance, it became something more. It became a statement. I am still here. I am still your king. I am still fighting. The question that lingered in the air, unspoken but unmistakable, was how much longer that statement would remain true. And as the car pulled away and the crowd slowly dispersed, each person returning to their ordinary life with its ordinary worries, that question followed them. It followed them to their homes, to their dinner tables, to their conversations with spouses and friends and colleagues. It became part of the national conversation, the background hum of anxiety that has characterized so much of British life in recent years. And it set the stage for everything that was to follow: the secret meetings, the shadow preparations, the quiet but unmistakable shift of power that is now underway behind the gilded doors of the palace. A king was ill. A nation was waiting, and in the wings a future king was watching and planning and preparing for a moment that no one wanted to acknowledge but everyone knew was coming. The sight of his father emerging from that hospital doorway, waving with one hand while the other gripped the frame for support, this is an image that will never leave Prince William's mind, however long he lives, and whatever triumphs or tragedies await him in the years ahead. We speak so often of the royal family as an institution, as a constitutional mechanism, as a tourist attraction funded by the sovereign grant, that we forget the basic human truth at its core. This is a family, with all the love and resentment and complicated history that word implies. And for William, watching his father's mortality become public property, watching the cameras capture every faltering step, watching the world speculate about how much time remains. This is not a matter of succession planning or constitutional procedure. This is personal. This is the man who taught him to fly helicopters, who sat through endless school plays and sports days, who wrote him letters when he was small and signed them Papa. This is his father, growing visibly frailer with each passing month, and there is nothing William can do to stop it except watch and wait and prepare for a moment he has dreaded his entire life, even as he has been trained for it since the cradle. But here is the cruel irony that the palace could never acknowledge publicly. William has been preparing for this moment for decades, and yet no amount of preparation can truly ready a man to watch his parent die. The interior monologue that plays beneath that carefully maintained public expression, the one that hints at smiles during engagements, that nods gravely at well-wishers, that performs the endless choreography of royal duty, is something far darker and more complicated than any of us can fully imagine. There is the obvious grief, the anticipatory mourning that accompanies any terminal diagnosis in a family. There is the terror, not for himself, but for his children, for George particularly, who at 11 years old is old enough to understand what is happening, but too young to process it with the stoicism the situation demands. There is the fury, white-hot and carefully suppressed, at the circumstances that have brought his family to this point, at the cancer that chose his father, at the years of smoking that may have contributed to it, at the sheer bloody unfairness of a man who waited 73 years to become king, being granted barely 2 years before his body began to betray him. And then, beneath all of that, there is something else, something that William would never admit aloud, that he probably barely admits to himself in the small hours of sleepless nights. There is the cold, calculating voice that whispers, "When he goes, it falls to me, and I'm not ready, and I may never be ready. But I have to be ready anyway, because the alternative is chaos." The pressure building around William is not merely emotional, although that alone would be enough to crush a lesser man. It is political, institutional, constitutional. Consider the position he occupies. His father is ill. His wife is recovering from her own cancer battle. His uncle has become a national disgrace whose very presence near the family taints everything it touches. And his brother has retreated to California to build a media empire on the foundation of familial grievance. The support network that should surround a future king has crumbled to dust, leaving William standing alone at the center of a storm that shows no signs of abating. And the storm is real. The calls for abolition that have bubbled beneath the surface of British life for decades are now louder than at any time since the dark days following Diana's death. The institution that William has spent his entire life preparing to lead is under threat not from Republicans with placards, although they exist and they are growing bolder, but from something far more dangerous: public indifference. When the Queen died, there was a moment of genuine national mourning, a sense that something irreplaceable had been lost. But the mourning was for Elizabeth, for the continuity she represented, for the thread connecting modern Britain to its past. It was not, fundamentally, for the monarchy as an institution, and the danger that keeps palace strategists awake at night is that when Charles goes, whenever that may be, the mourning may be perfunctory, the sense of loss muted, the transition to William greeted not with hope, but with a collective shrug. That is the nightmare scenario. That is what William must prevent, even as he watches his father fade. The Andrew situation. God, the Andrew situation. If you want to understand the weight pressing down on William's shoulders, you need only look at the mess his uncle has created and the impossibility of cleaning it up without leaving stains everywhere. The Duke of York's association with Jeffrey Epstein was not a momentary lapse of judgment, not a single unfortunate friendship that got out of hand. It was a decades-long entanglement with a convicted sex offender, conducted with the full knowledge of the royal family, and, it must be said, with the apparent protection of the late Queen herself. Royal historian Andrew Lowney has been devastatingly clear on this point. Elizabeth certainly protected Andrew, and in doing so, she passed an unexploded bomb to her successor. That bomb is now ticking beneath Charles's throne, and by extension, beneath William's future throne as well. The recent arrest of Andrew, the first senior royal to be arrested in modern history, let us not forget that detail, for allegedly passing confidential information to Epstein during his time as trade envoy has blown the situation wide open. The charges are specific, the evidence is reportedly substantial, and the palace's ability to contain the damage is severely limited by the fact that Charles himself felt compelled to issue a personally signed statement insisting that the law must take its course. That statement was unprecedented. That statement was a warning. And that statement was directed as much at his own family as at the wider public. What must William think as he watches this unfold? On one level, there is the fury that any decent man would feel at the spectacle of his uncle's behavior and the damage it has done to vulnerable people. On another level, there is the exasperation that has been building for years, the knowledge that he and others urged action against Andrew as far back as that awful BBC interview in 2019, the one where Andrew attempted to explain away his friendship with Epstein and succeeded only in making everything infinitely worse. On yet another level, there's the cold political calculation that William can never escape, the recognition that every day Andrew remains connected to the family in any way is a day the monarchy's moral authority bleeds away. And beneath all of that, there is the fear that if it is ultimately found that the family enabled or protected Andrew, the consequences will be catastrophic. Loney again. If that happens, Charles will have to stand aside. And if Charles stands aside, William becomes king not in the fullness of time, not after a period of dignified transition, but immediately, chaotically, in the midst of a scandal that could destroy everything his grandmother spent 70 years building. And then there is Catherine. Always there is Catherine. The woman who has become not merely William's wife, but his anchor, his advisor, his co-strategist in the long game of royal survival. Her own cancer diagnosis and treatment have added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Watching her suffer, watching her fight, watching her emerge from treatment with that same determined smile she has worn since the day they met, this has clearly deepened William's love for her while simultaneously intensifying his fear of losing her. The long-term consequence of their shared ordeal is a bond that may prove unbreakable, but it is also a bond forged in the fires of mutual vulnerability. They have seen each other at their weakest. They have held each other through treatments and recoveries and the terrifying uncertainty of medical prognoses. And through it all, they have maintained the public facade, performing their duties, smiling for the cameras, raising their children with as much normality as such an abnormal existence permits. The question that haunts William, the question he cannot speak aloud even to Catherine, is whether her health will permit her to shoulder the burden that awaits. Because when he becomes king, she becomes queen. And the role of queen consort in the modern era is not the decorative position it once was. It is active, demanding, unrelenting. It requires strength that Catherine has in abundance, but strength that cancer has tested to its limits. The atmosphere surrounding William in recent months has been described by those who observe these things closely as one of coiled tension, a spring compressed so tightly that any release feels impossible. Courtiers speak of a man who is focused to the point of obsession, who demands detailed briefings on every aspect of royal business, who questions assumptions that would have been accepted without challenge in his grandmother's day. This is not micromanagement for its own sake. This is a man who knows that the clock is running, that his father's time is limited, that his own moment is approaching faster than anyone anticipated, and that he must be prepared for every eventuality, because the consequences of being unprepared are unthinkable. The long-term consequence of this pressure, if it continues unabated, is a question that keeps palace insiders awake at night. Will William emerge from this crucible as a strong and effective monarch, tempered by adversity and ready to lead? Or will the weight prove too much, crushing the humanity that makes him relatable and leaving only the institutional figurehead that the Constitution requires? The answer, whatever it may be, is being written now, in the secret meetings and hushed conversations and sleepless nights that fill the space between public engagements. And as Charles fights his battle, and Catherine fights hers, and Andrew's shadow grows longer with each passing day, William waits. He watches, he prepares, and he wonders, as any son would wonder, how much time remains. The peculiar geography of royal privacy has always fascinated me. Not the privacy of public spaces, you understand, the palaces and gardens and ceremonial routes that are technically private but functionally public, photographed and filmed and analyzed by 1,000 eager eyes. No, I mean the real privacy. The spaces so deeply buried within those ancient walls that no camera has ever penetrated them, no journalist has ever described them, no member of the public has ever glimpsed them. It is in these spaces that the zhenzheng business of monarchy is conducted, not the ceremonial business of state openings and garden parties, but the real business, the business of family, of succession, of survival. And it was in one such space, in the late winter of 2025, that a series of meetings began whose existence the palace would deny if asked, and whose content will likely remain secret for decades, if not forever. The room itself, if we are to imagine it, would be nothing like the gilded state apartments tourists queue to see. Smaller, certainly. More intimate. A fire burning in the grate because these old buildings are impossible to heat properly. A decanter of something amber on a side table, barely touched. And 2 men, father and son, sitting in armchairs that have held the weight of generations before them, speaking in voices so low that even the most determined eavesdropper would catch only fragments. The atmosphere in that room, and in the subsequent meetings that followed over the coming weeks, was described by someone close to palace circles as charged with everything that could not be said aloud. This is the essential context that outsiders so often miss about royal relationships. The unsaid weighs far more heavily than the said. For Charles and William, the unsaid included decades of complicated history. The childhood years when Charles was absent, pursuing his naval career or his relationship with Camilla. The teenage years when William became his mother's confidant and protector. The young adult years when he watched his father's public image slowly rehabilitate while his mother's legacy was debated and dissected. The recent years when he has watched his father age with terrifying speed. All of that history sat in the room with them, invisible but palpable, influencing every word and every silence. And then there was the immediate context, the cancer, the treatment, the uncertainty, the knowledge that every meeting could be the last meaningful conversation they would ever have, the pressure to resolve, in a handful of private sessions, issues that would normally be allowed to unfold over years or decades. The meetings were, by all accounts, intensely focused, no small talk, no reminiscing, no time for the luxury of emotion when the business at hand was so urgent and so vast. The business at hand, to be precise, was Andrew. Always Andrew. The Duke of York had become, in the words of a source behind closed doors, the family member who cannot be mentioned in polite company but cannot be ignored either. The recent arrest, the allegations about passing information to Epstein during his trade envoy years, the growing pressure from law enforcement and the media and the public, all of it had converged into a crisis that threatened not merely Andrew's reputation, but the institution's very survival. Charles, with his constitutional mindset and his deep respect for due process, was inclined to let the law take its course and deal with the consequences when they became clear. William, with his more modern sensibility and his fury at the damage Andrew had caused, was reportedly adamant that the family needed to act decisively and immediately. The tension between these approaches played out across multiple meetings, with father and son circling each other like chess players, each trying to anticipate the other's moves while protecting what they saw as the monarchy's essential interests. The courtiers present for these discussions, and there were always courtiers present, because nothing in the palace happens without witnesses, described the dynamic as respectful but electric, with William pushing harder than he ever had before, and Charles, weakened by treatment and exhausted by the weight of it all, struggling to maintain his authority. What made the discussions particularly fraught was the ghost of the late Queen, hovering over every decision. Elizabeth had protected Andrew for decades. She had loved him, as mothers do, with a love that transcended logic and evidence. She had funded his lifestyle, supported his public role, and shielded him from consequences that would have destroyed any other public figure. Charles, who had watched this dynamic from the wings for years, understood his mother's motives even as he disagreed with her methods. William, who had grown up in the shadow of his grandmother's reign, was less forgiving. The Queen's protection of Andrew, in William's view, had been a catastrophic error that had allowed the situation to fester and worsen until it reached its current crisis point. The long-term consequence of that protection was now Charles's problem, and by extension, William's future problem, and the unfairness of it all hung in the air like smoke. He didn't ask for this, a source within the inner circle said of Charles. He inherited a crown and a time bomb simultaneously, and the timer is running out faster than anyone anticipated. The meetings expanded beyond Andrew, inevitably, because one crisis never travels alone in royal life. There was the question of Harry, always the question of Harry, lurking at the edge of every conversation like a wound that will not heal. The irony was almost operatic in its cruelty. The brother William had pushed away, the brother he had frozen out after the Oprah interview and the Netflix series and the memoir, might now be necessary to the family's survival. The calculus was brutally simple. With Andrew disgraced and increasingly isolated, with Anne devoted to her own engagements but not a public figure in the same way, with Edward and Sophie beloved but not central, the monarchy's senior ranks were thinning at exactly the moment when strength in numbers was most needed. Harry, for all his faults, for all his bitterness and public betrayal, remained a prince of the blood. He remained the spare, the backup, the insurance policy that every monarchy requires. And if the worst happened, if Charles's health collapsed entirely, if William needed to step up before he was ready, if the institution faced an existential crisis, Harry's presence, even a reluctant and resentful presence, might make the difference between survival and collapse. The conversations about Harry were, by all accounts, the most painful of all. Charles, the father who had failed both his sons in different ways, who had watched them drift apart and been powerless to stop it, who now faced the prospect of dying without reconciling them. Charles could barely speak of it without emotion overwhelming him. William, the older brother who had been betrayed in ways the public would never fully understand, who had trusted Harry with his darkest moments and seen those confidences turned into content, who had watched his wife and children become collateral damage in his brother's war with the institution. William could barely speak of it at all. And then there was Catherine. Always, in these meetings, the question of Catherine. Her own health struggles had added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The timing could not have been worse, or perhaps it could not have been better, depending on one's perspective. The argument for slowing down, for waiting, for allowing events to unfold at their own pace was undermined by the recognition that no one knew how much time anyone had. Catherine's recovery was proceeding, thank God, but recovery is not the same as strength, and strength is what would be required in the months and years ahead. The planning for William's eventual succession, which had always been conducted in the abstract as a theoretical exercise for some distant future, suddenly needed to become concrete. And Catherine, who understood better than anyone what kind of monarchy William wanted to lead, who had been quietly observing and learning and preparing for a role she had never sought but had grown into with remarkable grace, Catherine was essential to those plans. The meetings began to include discussions of her involvement, her insights, her preferences, not in any formal sense, because that would violate every protocol, but in the way that family conversations inevitably include the absent spouse whose presence shapes every decision. The long-term consequence of these secret meetings, the meetings that the palace would never acknowledge and the public would never witness, is only now beginning to become clear. The monarchy is not a static institution. It adapts or it dies. And what was being negotiated in those private rooms, in those hushed conversations between a dying king and his impatient heir, was nothing less than the terms of that adaptation. How much power would William assume before the crown formally passed to him? How visible would his shadow reign become? How would the transition be managed when the moment came, as it inevitably would, sooner rather than later? These were not questions that could be answered in a single meeting or even a series of meetings. They were questions that would be answered gradually, through 1,000 small decisions and a handful of large ones, through the accumulation of authority and the erosion of tradition, through the simple fact that when a king is ill and his heir is healthy, power flows toward health regardless of constitutional niceties. The meetings were not the story. The meetings were the symptom. The story was the transfer of power itself, happening in real time, behind heavily locked doors, while the world outside went about its business, unaware that history was being written in whispers. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when power begins to shift before anyone has formally acknowledged that a shift is occurring. You can see it in the way courtiers incline their heads when a particular figure enters a room. You can hear it in the slight change of inflection when that figure's name is mentioned in meetings. You can feel it in the atmosphere at engagements, the almost imperceptible adjustment of attention from the sovereign who still holds the title to the heir who increasingly holds the authority. And if you had been observing the royal family closely in the early months of 2025, you would have witnessed precisely such a moment unfolding. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, the man who has spent his entire life waiting for a throne he never sought but cannot escape, has crossed an invisible line. He is no longer merely the heir apparent, the future king, the one for whom the country waits. He has become, in all but name and constitutional formality, the unofficial king. The shadow reign has begun. The evidence for this transformation is not found in any single event or announcement, because the palace understands better than anyone that power transitions must be managed with exquisite care. No, the evidence is found in the accumulation of small details, the pattern of behavior that emerges when one steps back and looks at the broader picture. Consider the diplomatic engagements that have quietly shifted from Charles's calendar to William's, the meetings with foreign leaders that once would have been conducted by the sovereign, but are now being handled by the heir. The policy discussions, the strategic planning sessions, the confidential briefings that increasingly flow toward Kensington Palace rather than Buckingham Palace. A well-placed source described the situation with characteristic understatement. The machinery of monarchy is complex, and it adapts to circumstances without needing formal direction. People understand who they need to be speaking to, and they adjust accordingly. The adjustment has been occurring for months, accelerating with each new development in Charles's health, each fresh crisis involving Andrew, each reminder that the present cannot be relied upon and the future must be prepared for. What makes this shadow reign particularly fascinating is the contrast between William's public persona and his private authority. In public, he remains the dutiful son, the supportive heir, the family man devoted to his wife and children. He smiles, he waves, he performs the endless rituals of royal life with the professionalism that has become his trademark. But behind the scenes, according to someone close to palace circles, he has become extraordinarily assertive in ways that would have been unthinkable even a year ago. He questions decisions that would previously have been accepted without challenge. He demands explanations for policies and practices that have gone unquestioned for decades. He insists on being consulted about appointments, about strategy, about the future direction of an institution that has survived for 1,000 years by adapting slowly and carefully to changing circumstances. The long-term consequence of this assertiveness is still unfolding, but its immediate effect has been to create a kind of dual monarchy, with Charles holding the title and William holding increasing amounts of the actual power. The situation with Andrew provides perhaps the clearest illustration of how this shadow reign operates in practice. When the Duke of York's latest scandal broke, it was William who reportedly took the lead in determining the family's response. It was William who insisted on a firm and unequivocal stance, who pushed back against any suggestion of protective ambiguity, who made clear that the days of shielding Andrew from consequences were over. Charles, weakened by treatment and burdened by the weight of his mother's legacy, was initially inclined toward a more measured approach. But William prevailed, and the palace's response, the unprecedented personally signed statement from Charles, insisting that the law must take its course, bore the unmistakable imprint of the heir's influence. A source behind closed doors put it bluntly. William has been clear about Andrew for years. He thinks his grandmother made a catastrophic error in protecting him, and he is determined not to repeat that mistake. The difference now is that he has the authority to make that determination stick. The machinery of monarchy is reorienting itself around this new reality in ways both large and small. Staff who once reported exclusively to the sovereign now find themselves taking direction from the heir's office. Budget decisions that would previously have been made at Buckingham Palace are increasingly being shaped by considerations from Kensington Palace. The long-term planning that was once conducted in the abstract, as an exercise for some distant future, has become immediate and concrete. And through it all, the public sees only the carefully curated images of family unity, the joint appearances, the shared engagements, the smiling photographs that suggest everything is proceeding according to plan. The gap between public perception and private reality has rarely been wider, and it is widening with each passing week. The emotional toll of this shadow reign on William himself is something the palace works hard to conceal, but glimpses of it emerge nonetheless. The man who once found escape in the cockpit of an air ambulance helicopter, who spoke openly about the therapeutic value of flying, who described the freedom of being just another pilot doing a job that mattered. That man has not been seen for some time. The demands of his unofficial kingship leave no room for escape, no space for the ordinary pursuits that once grounded him. Every moment is consumed by meetings, by briefings, by the endless weight of responsibility that grows heavier with each passing day. A longtime family acquaintance described him as someone who has aged 10 years in the past 12 months, not in appearance, but in bearing. He carries himself like a man who knows the world is watching and the stakes could not be higher. The relationship between William and Charles has inevitably been affected by this shift in the balance of power. There is no public estrangement, no visible tension, nothing that would provide fodder for the tabloids. But those who observe these things closely describe a dynamic that has fundamentally changed. The father, who once guided and advised, now increasingly defers. The son, who once sought approval, now increasingly determines direction. The conversations that once ranged across the full spectrum of royal business now focus almost exclusively on transition, on what will happen, when it will happen, how it will be managed. These are not easy conversations for any father and son, and they are made infinitely more difficult by the knowledge that the transition they are discussing is being driven by illness rather than by the natural passage of time. A source within the inner circle put it with painful honesty. Charles knows what is happening. He sees his authority flowing toward his son, and he understands why it must be so. But understanding does not make it easy. No man wants to watch his own relevance fade while he is still breathing. The long-term consequences of this shadow reign extend far beyond the personal dynamics between father and son. They touch on fundamental questions about the nature of monarchy itself. The British Constitution, such as it is, provides no mechanism for a partial transfer of sovereignty, no halfway house between king and heir. The sovereign is the sovereign, and until that sovereign dies or abdicates, the heir remains merely the heir. But reality is more flexible than law, and the reality of 2025 is that William is increasingly functioning as king in all but name while his father fights for his health. The implications for the future are profound. When the formal transition finally occurs, whether in months or years, no one can say with certainty, it will not be the beginning of William's reign, but the formal confirmation of a reign that has already been underway. The coronation, when it comes, will be ceremony rather than substance, the public acknowledgement of a reality that has long since been established behind closed doors. And through it all, Catherine watches and plans and prepares for a role she never sought but has grown into with a grace that has surprised even those who knew her best. Her own health struggles have given her a perspective that few can share, an understanding of mortality that shapes every decision she makes. She knows better than anyone that the future cannot be taken for granted, that plans can be disrupted in an instant, that the only certainty is uncertainty itself. And so she works, quietly and carefully, building the foundations for a reign that may come sooner than anyone wants, and later than anyone expects. The Shadow King has his Shadow Queen, and together they are preparing for a moment that will define not only their own lives, but the future of an institution that has survived for 1,000 years. The question that haunts them both, the question they cannot speak aloud even to each other, is whether that institution will survive their stewardship. The answer is being written now, in the secret meetings and hushed conversations and carefully calibrated decisions that fill every hour of every day. And the world watches and waits and wonders what comes next. The most remarkable thing about Catherine, the Princess of Wales, is how utterly unremarkable she manages to appear while carrying burdens that would crush most human beings. This is not a criticism, you understand, but the highest form of praise I can offer. In an age of relentless self-promotion, of carefully curated social media presence and calculated public performances, Catherine has achieved something genuinely rare. She has become indispensable without ever appearing to seek importance. She has shouldered responsibilities that would terrify career diplomats while maintaining the demeanor of a woman who simply wants to get on with things. And now, in the shadows of 2025, while the world focuses on Charles's health and William's rising authority and Andrew's continuing disgrace, Catherine has quietly accepted an assignment that reveals more about the future of the monarchy than any number of official announcements ever could. She is planning the coronation. Not in any formal sense, not with public acknowledgement or constitutional authority, but in the way that matters most in royal circles, quietly, carefully, and with absolute discretion. The sensitivity of this assignment cannot be overstated. Planning a coronation is, by its nature, an act of profound optimism and equally profound realism. It assumes a future while acknowledging the contingency of the present. It requires detailed preparation for an event that may occur next year, or in 5 years, or in 10, while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that such preparation is merely prudent housekeeping, rather than anticipatory grief. For Catherine, who has spent the past year fighting her own battle with cancer, who has known the terror of facing her own mortality while watching her father-in-law face his, the emotional complexity of this task is almost beyond comprehension. She is planning the moment when her husband becomes king, the moment when she becomes queen, the moment when their children's lives are transformed forever. And she is doing so while knowing that the catalyst for that moment will be the death of a man she has come to love as a second father, a man who welcomed her into this strange and demanding family when others might have kept their distance. The interior world of Catherine, as she undertakes this assignment, is a landscape few can imagine and fewer still could navigate. There is the obvious practical burden, the sheer logistical complexity of coordinating with senior courtiers, with expert planners, with the myriad departments and agencies whose involvement will be essential when the moment finally arrives. There are the centuries of tradition to honor, the protocols to observe, the expectations to manage. There is the delicate balance between continuity and change, between respecting what has gone before and signaling what is to come. But beneath all of that, there is something far more personal and far more painful. There is the knowledge that every decision she makes, every detail she approves, every element of the ceremony she shapes is a bet on a future that remains profoundly uncertain. The long-term consequence of her work will be a coronation that feels seamless, inevitable, perfectly executed, but only if she does her job well enough that no one ever realizes how much preparation went into making it appear effortless. The atmosphere surrounding Catherine as she works on this project has been described by someone close to the couple as charged with a kind of determined calm. She meets with planners in private rooms at Kensington Palace, away from the cameras and the courtiers and the endless scrutiny that follows her every public movement. She reviews documents late at night after the children are asleep and the official engagements are complete. She consults with William, naturally, because no decision of this magnitude could be made without him, but she also consults with people William never sees, the behind-the-scenes professionals whose expertise will shape every aspect of the ceremony. A source within the inner circle offered a rare glimpse into her mindset. She approaches it the way she approaches everything, methodically, thoughtfully, with enormous attention to detail. But there's an added layer now, a recognition that time may be shorter than anyone wants to admit. She doesn't say it aloud, but you can see it in her eyes. She's preparing for something that may come sooner than any of us are ready for. The question of timing haunts every aspect of these preparations, even as the participants carefully avoid discussing it directly. Charles's health remains the great unknown, the variable that no amount of planning can control. His doctors are optimistic, or at least they project optimism, but optimism in the context of cancer is a qualified and conditional thing. He continues his treatments, continues his engagements, continues to project the image of a monarch determined to serve as long as his body permits. But the body, as we are all eventually reminded, has its own timetable, and the recognition that Charles's reign may be measured in years rather than decades, that William's accession may come far sooner than anyone anticipated when the late Queen died, hangs over every conversation about the future. Catherine, who has learned through her own health struggles that certainty is an illusion, navigates this uncertainty with a grace that masks the emotional toll it must exact. She plans for a coronation that may be years away while knowing it could be months away. She prepares her children for a future that may arrive at any moment while trying to preserve their childhood for as long as possible. She supports William through his own anticipatory grief while managing her own. And she does it all with that smile, that poise, that apparently effortless composure that has become her trademark. The relationship between Catherine and Charles has deepened during this period, as shared vulnerability often does. The king has watched his daughter-in-law fight her battle with the same quiet determination he has tried to muster for his own. He has seen her continue to work, continue to appear, continue to support her family even on days when treatment must have left her exhausted. And he has come to rely on her in ways that surprise even those who know them both well. A longtime family acquaintance described the dynamic with genuine warmth. Charles has always admired Catherine, always appreciated the stability she brought to William's life. But admiration is different from trust, and trust is what has grown between them over these past months. He knows she understands what he's going through in ways that even William cannot fully grasp. He knows she will be there for William when he's gone, and he knows, perhaps most importantly, that she will protect the institution he has spent his entire life preparing to lead. The long-term consequence of Catherine's involvement in coronation planning extends far beyond the ceremony itself. It signals a fundamental shift in how the monarchy understands the role of the consort. For centuries, the spouse of the sovereign was expected to be decorative rather than functional, supportive rather than substantive. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, carved out a more active role, but she was the exception rather than the rule. Princess Diana transformed the public expectations of a royal wife, but her transformation was personal rather than institutional. Catherine is doing something different. She is embedding herself in the machinery of monarchy, ensuring that when her moment comes, she will be not merely present, but prepared, not merely supportive, but essential. The coronation she is planning will bear her imprint in ways that will become visible only to those who know where to look. And when William finally ascends the throne, he will do so with a partner who has already done the hardest work of preparing for a role that neither of them sought, but both have accepted with remarkable grace. The practical challenges of planning a coronation in secret while maintaining the public facade that nothing unusual is happening are almost unimaginable. There are budgets to consider, though no one will discuss them openly. There are guest lists to draft, though no one will acknowledge their existence. There are security arrangements to coordinate, though no one will admit that such coordination is underway. There are centuries of tradition to honor, even as the planners quietly consider which traditions might be modified or abandoned for a new reign. And through it all, there is the constant pressure of discretion, the knowledge that any leak, any hint of these preparations reaching the public could be disastrous. The palace has spent decades cultivating an image of stability and continuity, and the revelation that detailed coronation planning is already underway would shatter that image in ways that would serve no one's interests. So Catherine works in the shadows, meeting with planners at odd hours, reviewing documents that bear no official markings, making decisions that will shape history, while ensuring that no trace of those decisions ever reaches the morning papers. And then there is the personal dimension, the dimension that no amount of planning can fully address. Catherine is preparing for a moment that will transform her life, her marriage, her children's lives in ways she can only partially anticipate. She will become queen, with all the weight and responsibility and scrutiny the title implies. Her children will become direct heirs to the throne, with all the pressure and expectation and loss of privacy that entails. Her husband will become king, and she will watch him shoulder a burden that has broken lesser men. She knows all of this, has known it since the day she married William, has prepared for it in every way that preparation is possible. But knowing and experiencing are different things, and the gap between them can only be bridged by the event itself. So she plans, and she waits, and she hopes that the moment is still far enough away to allow for more time, more preparation, more life before everything changes. The long-term consequence of her work is a coronation that will appear seamless when it finally occurs. But the immediate consequence is a woman carrying a weight that no one sees and few can imagine, carrying it with grace and determination and that apparently effortless composure that has become her greatest strength and, perhaps, her greatest burden. The arrest of a senior royal is not the sort of event for which there is an established protocol, and this absence of procedure speaks volumes about the nature of the British monarchy itself. For 1,000 years, the Crown has positioned itself above the mundane machinery of law enforcement, not in the sense of being beyond the law, although historically that was sometimes the case, but in the sense of being so thoroughly embedded in the constitutional order that the idea of handcuffs on royal wrists was simply unimaginable. That imagining became abruptly, jarringly necessary in early 2025, when Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, was taken into custody for questioning regarding allegations that he had passed confidential information to Jeffrey Epstein during his years as a trade envoy. The scene itself was almost surreal in its ordinary horror. Police vehicles arriving at Royal Lodge, the sprawling Windsor estate where Andrew has resided for years, and the Duke himself being escorted not to a waiting limousine, but to a nondescript vehicle that could have been collecting any suspect from any address in the country. The photographs that emerged, because photographs always emerge, showed a man who appeared stunned, as though the reality of his situation had only just begun to penetrate the protective bubble in which he has lived for 7 decades. The atmosphere surrounding that arrest was thick with a kind of grim inevitability, the sense that a reckoning long deferred had finally arrived whether anyone was ready for it or not. For years, the palace had managed to contain the damage from Andrew's association with Epstein, first through silence, then through carefully worded denials, then through the disastrous BBC interview that was supposed to clear his name, and instead cemented his public disgrace. Through it all, the late Queen had protected him, funding his lifestyle, maintaining his official residences, ensuring that he remained part of the family even as the family's reputation suffered for his presence. But the Queen was gone now, and the protection she had extended did not survive her. Charles, for all his constitutional propriety, could not shield his brother from the consequences of actions that had finally caught up with him. And William, watching from the wings with that coiled tension that has become his defining characteristic, was reportedly adamant that no attempt at protection would be made. "The law must take its course," Charles's statement read, and for the first time in modern memory, the law was taking its course with a member of the royal family in the defendant's role rather than the observer's. The interior monologue of Andrew himself, as he sat through hours of questioning, must have been a fascinating and terrible thing. Here was a man who had spent his entire life at the center of privilege, who had been born into a world where doors opened automatically and consequences were for other people. Here was the Queen's favorite son, the golden boy of his generation, the dashing Falklands veteran who had somehow spiraled into a friendship with one of history's most notorious sex offenders. Here was a man who had convinced himself, apparently sincerely, that he had done nothing wrong, that his associations were innocent, that the mounting evidence against him was somehow a misunderstanding or a conspiracy. And now here he was, in a room with no royal crest on the wall, answering questions from investigators who were not impressed by his lineage and not intimidated by his connections. The psychological whiplash of that experience, the collision between a lifetime of entitlement and the cold reality of legal accountability, must have been almost physically painful. And yet, watching the footage of his arrival and departure, one saw not remorse, but a kind of bewildered indignation, as though he genuinely could not understand why this was happening to him. The palace response to the arrest was, by necessity, swift and carefully calibrated. Charles's statement, issued personally rather than through the usual channels, was remarkable for its lack of ambiguity. There would be no protection, no special treatment, no suggestion that the Duke's position entitled him to any consideration beyond that afforded to any other citizen. The statement was brief, almost curt, and it left no room for interpretation. But statements are easy. Actions are harder, and the actions that followed the arrest revealed the true complexity of the situation. Andrew's remaining official patronages, those that had somehow survived the earlier scandals, were quietly removed from palace websites. His military affiliations, the honorary positions that meant so much to a man who had once defined himself by his naval service, were suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. His access to royal residences, his use of palace facilities, his participation in family events, all of it was placed under review, with the clear implication that nothing would ever be the same. A source behind closed doors described the atmosphere at Buckingham Palace in the days following the arrest as funereal, but with an undercurrent of relief that something was finally being done. The long-term consequences of the Andrew crisis extend far beyond the fate of one disgraced prince. They touch on the fundamental question of what the monarchy is for in the 21st century, and whether an institution built on privilege and deference can survive in a world that increasingly demands accountability and transparency. The historical parallels drawn by royal commentators have been stark and unsettling. The abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII's determination to marry Wallis Simpson forced a constitutional confrontation that nearly brought down the monarchy. The aftermath of Diana's death in 1997, when the palace's initial coldness toward public grief threatened to permanently alienate the institution from the people it supposedly served. Both crises were survived, but both left scars that took years to heal. The Andrew crisis, some are now suggesting, could be worse than either. Not because the allegations against him are more serious, although they are serious indeed, but because they touch on something deeper. The question of whether the royal family has been protecting one of its own at the expense of justice for victims. If evidence emerges that the palace knew more than it has admitted, that it actively shielded Andrew from consequences, that it prioritized institutional reputation over moral responsibility, the damage could be catastrophic. The emotional impact on Charles, already fighting for his health and struggling with the weight of an unexpectedly burdensome reign, has been described by those close to him as profoundly destabilizing. Here was the brother he had grown up with, played with, served alongside in the Navy. Here was the brother their mother had loved with a love that sometimes seemed to exclude her other children. Here was the brother whose behavior had been a source of private anguish for decades and whose actions were now threatening to undo everything Charles had spent his life preparing to protect. The interviews Charles has reportedly given about the situation, the private conversations with advisors and confidants, reveal a man caught between familial loyalty and institutional duty, between the love he still feels for his brother and the fury he feels at the damage his brother has caused. A well-meaning staff member who has worked with Charles for years offered a rare glimpse into his mindset. He looks at Andrew and sees not just a brother, but a warning. A warning about what happens when privilege is untethered from responsibility, when the protections of royalty become protections from accountability. He is determined that William will not face the same choices with George that he now faces with Andrew. But determination is not the same as solution, and the solution to Andrew remains elusive. The public reaction to the arrest has been instructive in its lack of surprise. The British people, it seems, had already made up their minds about Andrew years ago, and the arrest merely confirmed what they believed they already knew. The tabloids, those reliable barometers of public sentiment, have been uniformly harsh, with headlines that would have been unthinkable a generation ago when the royal family still commanded reflexive deference. The broadsheets have been more measured but no less damning, publishing detailed analyses of the allegations and their implications for the monarchy's future. And on social media, where the old rules of engagement do not apply, the response has been brutal. Memes, mockery, and a widespread sense that justice, however delayed, is finally being served. The long-term consequence of this public reaction is a further erosion of the deference that once protected the royal family from scrutiny. When a prince can be arrested like any other citizen, when the palace cannot shield him from consequences, when the public responds with satisfaction rather than sympathy, something fundamental has shifted in the relationship between crown and country. And through it all, William watches and learns and prepares for a future in which the Andrew problem will be his problem to manage. The lessons he is absorbing from this crisis will shape his entire reign if and when it comes. He is learning that protection has limits, that privilege has costs, that the institution he will inherit cannot survive if it is seen to place family loyalty above moral responsibility. He is learning that the public's patience with royal scandal is finite, that the deference his grandmother commanded cannot be assumed by his generation, that every day the monarchy fails to hold itself accountable is a day the case for abolition grows stronger. He is learning, perhaps most painfully, that the family he loves contains members whose actions threaten everything he is trying to build, and he is preparing, in ways that will become visible only when his reign begins, to ensure that the Andrew crisis becomes not merely a scandal survived, but a lesson learned. The long-term consequence of this moment, if William has anything to do with it, will be a monarchy that understands its vulnerabilities and takes active steps to address them. Whether that understanding comes in time to save the institution he has spent his life preparing to lead is a question that only the future can answer. The very idea of a reconciliation between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex is the sort of proposition that would have been dismissed as absurd fantasy only a few months ago, and the fact that it is now being discussed in serious terms by people who ought to know better tells you everything you need to understand about the desperation that has begun to permeate palace circles. These are not brothers who had a falling out over a misunderstood comment or a forgotten birthday. These are brothers who have spent years engaged in a war of attrition, fought through television interviews, tell-all memoirs, and carefully timed media leaks. These are brothers whose wives regard each other with a hostility so profound that it has become its own subplot in the ongoing drama of royal dysfunction. These are brothers who sat in the same room at their grandfather's funeral, at their grandmother's funeral, at the statue unveiling for their mother, and could not bring themselves to exchange more than the most perfunctory of pleasantries. To speak of reconciliation in this context is not merely optimistic. It is to ignore the accumulated weight of years of mutual betrayal and public humiliation. And yet, according to sources behind closed doors, that is precisely what is being discussed in the hushed corridors of Kensington Palace, and presumably in the sun-drenched hills of Montecito as well. The calculus driving these discussions is brutally simple and profoundly depressing. William is running out of allies. His father is ill, his uncle is disgraced, his wife is recovering from cancer, and the senior ranks of the royal family are thinning at exactly the moment when strength in numbers is most needed. The Andrew crisis has made clear that the family cannot rely on the old strategies of containment and denial. The public and the press are no longer willing to look the other way. The calls for abolition, once confined to the fringes of political discourse, have moved into the mainstream, fueled by scandals that show no sign of abating. And through it all, William faces the prospect of inheriting a throne that may be significantly less stable than the one his grandmother occupied for 7 decades. In this context, the idea of bringing Harry back into the fold, of presenting a united front against the threats facing the institution, begins to look less like emotional reconciliation and more like cold, calculated survival. A source within the inner circle put it with brutal honesty. William doesn't want to reconcile with Harry. He doesn't trust him, doesn't like him, doesn't believe he has anything to offer beyond his name. But he may not have a choice. The monarchy needs every hand on deck, and Harry is a hand, however damaged and unreliable. The interior monologue of William, as he contemplates this possibility, must be almost unbearable in its complexity. Here is the brother who betrayed him, who turned their private grief into public content, who allowed his wife to be portrayed as a villain in the narrative the Sussexes constructed for global consumption. Here is the brother who sat in that garden with Oprah and described the family in terms that bordered on racist, who accused unnamed royals of callous indifference to Meghan's mental health struggles, who systematically dismantled the institution William has spent his life preparing to lead. Here is the brother who, in the aftermath of their grandfather's death, reportedly refused to speak to William directly, communicating instead through intermediaries. The idea of reaching out to this brother, of extending an olive branch, of pretending that the past years never happened, must feel like a betrayal of everything William holds dear. And yet, the alternative is to face the coming storms alone, to watch the monarchy's support erode while his father's health declines and his uncle's scandals multiply, to inherit a crown that may be worth far less than the one his grandmother passed on. The long-term consequence of this calculation, whatever William ultimately decides, will be a redefinition of family loyalty that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with institutional preservation. The atmosphere surrounding these discussions, insofar as they can be called discussions, is one of grim pragmatism, punctuated by moments of genuine pain. The palace advisors who have raised the possibility of reconciliation do so carefully, tentatively, aware that they are treading on ground littered with emotional landmines. They frame their arguments in terms of strategy rather than sentiment, pointing to polling data that suggests Harry's popularity, while diminished, remains significant among younger demographics. They note that Meghan, for all the controversy she attracts, has built a media empire that could be useful rather than adversarial if properly managed. They observe that the Sussex children are, after all, royal children, and that their absence from the family narrative creates a void that will only become more conspicuous as they grow older. But beneath these strategic arguments lies a deeper current of grief, the recognition that this family, already fractured by divorce and death and distance, may be approaching a point of no return. A longtime family acquaintance described the mood among those closest to William as haunted by the knowledge that if something doesn't change, there may be nothing left to save. The perspective from California is, predictably, more complicated and considerably less sympathetic. Harry, according to those who claim to know his thinking, has never stopped wanting to come home, never stopped longing for the family he left behind, never stopped believing that reconciliation is possible if only the palace would meet him halfway. This narrative, which the Sussexes have carefully cultivated through their various media ventures, portrays Harry as the wounded party, the victim of an institution that could not accept his choices or his wife. The reality, as anyone who has followed this saga with even minimal attention understands, is considerably less flattering. Harry has spent years attacking the family he now supposedly wants to rejoin, has profited handsomely from those attacks, has positioned himself as a truth-teller exposing royal dysfunction while conveniently omitting his own role in creating that dysfunction. The idea that he would welcome reconciliation is undoubtedly true. But the terms of that reconciliation, the conditions he would impose, the concessions he would demand, are likely to be fundamentally incompatible with the reality of royal life. Meghan, for her part, is said to view any overture from the palace with deep suspicion, seeing it not as an opportunity for healing, but as a strategic maneuver designed to neutralize the threat she and Harry represent. The long-term consequence of this family drama, regardless of how it resolves, will be felt for generations. If reconciliation occurs, it will be a reconciliation built on sand, a temporary truce in an ongoing war rather than a genuine healing of wounds. The trust that was destroyed through years of betrayal cannot be rebuilt through strategic necessity, and the resentments that have accumulated on both sides will not dissolve simply because the palace needs Harry's presence at public events. The Sussexes, if they return, will return as outsiders within their own family, watched carefully, trusted minimally, tolerated because they must be, rather than welcomed because they are loved. If reconciliation does not occur, the family will continue to fracture, with Harry and Meghan building their alternative brand, while William and Catherine struggle to maintain the institution's relevance. The monarchy will survive either outcome because monarchy is nothing if not adaptable, but the cost of survival will be measured in the continued erosion of the bonds that once held this family together. The tragic irony at the heart of this situation is that Harry, for all his faults, for all his bitterness and public betrayal, remains the brother William once loved, once trusted, once believed would stand beside him through whatever challenges the future brought. The photographs of them as boys, heads together, laughing at some private joke, still exist in the royal archives, still surface occasionally in documentaries and commemorative programs. The memory of walking behind their mother's coffin together, two children in a world of adults, heads bowed under a weight no child should bear, still lives in both of them, however deeply buried beneath years of accumulated grievance. And the possibility that those memories might be recovered, that the brothers might find their way back to each other, remains the one outcome that could actually strengthen the monarchy rather than merely prolong its decline. It is perhaps the cruelest twist of all that this possibility depends on the very qualities, humility, forgiveness, self-awareness, that have been in shortest supply on both sides of this divide. And so, William contemplates the unthinkable, weighing personal disgust against institutional survival, knowing that whatever he decides will carry consequences that extend far beyond his own feelings or his brother's. The Shadow King, already carrying so much, must now consider whether to reach out to the brother who tried to destroy everything he is trying to save. The scene at Westminster Abbey for the Commonwealth Day service was, by any objective measure, a triumph of royal stage management. The King and Queen, side by side in their places of honor, projecting an image of quiet dignity and continued purpose. The Prince and Princess of Wales, seated nearby, their public expressions carefully calibrated to suggest support rather than anticipation, loyalty rather than impatience. The Princess Royal, that steadfast pillar of royal duty, present as she has been for every significant occasion of the past 5 decades. The Earl and Countess of Wessex, reliable and uncomplicated, filling their designated roles without fuss or drama. And, scattered throughout the congregation, representatives from the 54 Commonwealth nations, diplomats and dignitaries and community leaders, all assembled to celebrate an institution that binds together a quarter of the world's population under the symbolic leadership of a man who may not have many more such appearances left in him. The cameras captured it all, as cameras always do, and the images that emerged were precisely what the palace had intended, a picture of unity, of continuity, of a royal family still capable of performing its essential functions despite the storms gathering at its gates. But the cameras, for all their ubiquity, cannot capture what lies beneath the surface. They cannot show the conversations that took place in the moments before the service began. The whispered exchanges between courtiers, the anxious glances toward the king as he made his way to his seat. They cannot reveal the contents of the briefings that had been circulated in the days leading up to the event, the contingency plans reviewed and updated, the quiet acknowledgments that this might be one of the last occasions when such a gathering would feel genuinely normal. They cannot convey the atmosphere in the room when the king's voice, still strong but noticeably thinner than it had been a year ago, carried the familiar words across the ancient space, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something precious, precisely because its continuation could not be guaranteed. The long-term consequence of such moments, the accumulation of public appearances that carry private weight, is a gradual shift in how the institution is perceived. The monarchy becomes not merely a constitutional mechanism, but a narrative of endurance against odds, of dignity maintained in the face of decline. And that narrative, carefully cultivated, may be the monarchy's best hope for surviving what comes next. The whispers of abdication, those persistent rumors that have circulated through palace corridors for months, were notably absent from public discussion of the Commonwealth service. This was by design. The palace has learned through centuries of experience that the most effective way to manage a narrative is not to deny speculation, but to render it irrelevant through the sheer force of continued normalcy. As long as the king appears, as long as he performs his duties, as long as he projects the image of a monarch in full command of his faculties and his office, the question of abdication recedes into the background. But those who watch these things closely, who have access to sources that the general public does not, understand that the question has not disappeared. It has merely been deferred, pending developments that no one can predict and everyone fears. A source well placed in palace circles offered a characteristically understated assessment. The king's health is what it is. There are good days and difficult days, and the balance between them is something the family manages privately. The public sees what it needs to see. What happens behind closed doors is another matter entirely. The strategy of managed transition, of preparing for a future that cannot be acknowledged while maintaining the fiction of an unchanging present, requires a level of coordination that would test any organization. Every public appearance must be carefully calibrated to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, reassuring the public that all is well, preparing them subtly for the possibility that it may not remain so, and providing material for the historical record that will eventually be written about this period. Every statement must be worded with an eye to how it will be interpreted not only today, but in the months and years ahead, when readers will search for clues about what was known and when. Every decision must balance the competing demands of transparency and discretion, honesty and hope. The Commonwealth Service succeeded on all these fronts, which is precisely why it appeared so effortless. The effort involved, the meetings and discussions and agonized deliberations that preceded it, will never be visible to the public. But the results speak for themselves. A family united in public, an institution functioning as intended, a narrative of continuity maintained against all evidence that continuity is precisely what cannot be assumed. And yet, for all the careful management, the cracks are visible to anyone who chooses to look. The absence of the Duke of York from the gathering was notable, not because his presence would have been expected. It has not been expected for some time, but because his absence served as a reminder of the scandal that continues to shadow the family. The Duke of Sussex was also absent, of course, as he has been from every such occasion since his departure, and his absence too carried meaning. Two princes, one disgraced and one estranged, their empty places in the family tableau, speaking volumes about the challenges that face the monarchy as it navigates the transition ahead. The long-term consequence of these absences is a thinning of the royal ranks that will become increasingly problematic as time passes. The king has fewer siblings than his mother had, and his children have fewer children than he had at their age. The institution, that once seemed inexhaustibly supplied with royal personages, is, in fact, remarkably fragile, dependent on the continued health and cooperation of a very small number of individuals. If anything happens to any of them, if illness or scandal or simple human frailty removes another figure from the available roster, the strain will become impossible to ignore. The murmurs of republicanism that have accompanied recent crises are not yet a serious threat to the monarchy's survival, but they are louder than they have been at any time since the aftermath of Diana's death. Polling data, carefully tracked by palace strategists, shows a gradual erosion of support among younger demographics, a growing indifference to an institution that once commanded reflexive loyalty. The Republican movement in Britain remains small and politically marginal, but it is no longer invisible, and its arguments about cost, about accountability, about the fundamental justice of hereditary privilege in a democratic age are gaining traction in circles where they would once have been dismissed out of hand. The palace response has been characteristically measured. More transparency about finances, more engagement with diverse communities, more emphasis on the monarchy's role in national life beyond the ceremonial. But these measures, however well-intentioned, cannot address the underlying question that haunts every discussion of the monarchy's future. What is it for in a country that has changed almost beyond recognition since the Queen ascended the throne 70 years ago? That question has no easy answer, and the difficulty of answering it is compounded by the personal crises that have dominated recent headlines. The king's determination to control the final chapter of his reign, to shape the narrative of his time on the throne, despite its likely brevity, is evident in every decision he makes. He continues to work, continues to appear, continues to project the image of a monarch fully engaged with the responsibilities of his office. He has made clear, through his actions if not his words, that he intends to be remembered not as the king who waited 70 years and then barely had time to make his mark, but as a sovereign who used whatever time he had to advance the causes that matter to him. The long-term consequence of this determination is a reign that may be short but will not be forgettable, a period of transition that lays the groundwork for whatever comes next. And what comes next, when it finally arrives, will be William's reign, shaped by William's priorities, defined by William's approach to an institution that has survived for 1,000 years and will, if he has anything to do with it, survive for 1,000 more. The question that lingers, as the cameras pack up and the dignitaries depart and the ancient abbey returns to its quiet rhythm of daily prayer, is whether survival is enough. The monarchy has survived crises before, has weathered scandals and wars and social transformations that would have destroyed lesser institutions. But survival is not the same as thriving, and the monarchy that emerges from this period of transition may be a diminished thing, respected rather than loved, tolerated rather than cherished. The crown that William will eventually inherit, whether in months or years, will be heavier than the one his grandmother wore, not because it is physically heavier, but because the expectations attached to it are more complicated and the loyalty it commands is less reflexive. He will need allies, and he will have fewer than he needs. He will need support, and the support he receives may be conditional on performance in ways it never was for his predecessors. He will need, above all, to convince a skeptical and increasingly indifferent public that the monarchy still matters, still serves a purpose, still deserves its place at the center of national life. And so, the shadow reign continues, the secret meetings proceed, the quiet preparations advance. The king fights his battle with whatever time remains. The queen supports him with the devotion she has shown since the day they married. The Princess of Wales plans a coronation she hopes is still years away while preparing for the possibility that it may come much sooner. The Duke of York's shadow lengthens, the Duke of Sussex watches from California, and the Prince of Wales waits and works, and wonders what kind of crown he will inherit when the moment finally arrives. The Commonwealth service was a triumph of stage management, but the play is far from over. The final act, whenever it comes, will determine not only the fate of this family, but the future of an institution that has defined British life for 1,000 years. And as the cameras capture the smiles and the waves and the carefully choreographed unity, the real drama continues behind closed doors, where kings and princes and the weight of history meet in rooms that will never be photographed and conversations that will never be reported. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.